Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. And I want to start today with a bit of a provocation, as it's pretty apparent that a lot about the world of work still needs to change in one way or another for it to feel okay and for it to feel safe with and for a lot of people. So I'd like to challenge us to reflect on this in this episode. There are a lot of stats around pay gap, a lot of stats around gender diversity at a leadership level, stats around harassment, discrimination, and around violence towards women, in some cases resulting in death, as has been made known to us quite prominently in the media in the last few weeks as well. So it's a big thing, and it's something that it feels like we need to address. And to have today's conversation is really important. So I think if we as humans, in whichever way we identify, male, female, or otherwise, as people who participate in the world of work, we almost have a duty of care when it comes to keeping people safe. And as leaders, we want to bring some of the conditions together that make that work and to build on the workplace as a positive environment in some way, both establishing safety in the workplace, but also setting conditions for success so that people can flourish in some way or another. So in this month, we've been talking about growth and how businesses and organizations can set the foundations for success in some way. And I've got a feeling that we've had those chats, and I really want to go a bit deeper today. And I think we need to go deeper for bigger change to be made possible in some way. So to think about the people who we are and to also bring more of ourselves to the work that we do every day. So who are we and who are we bringing to work each day? And I've got a feeling that this will be a kind of fitting conclusion to this month's theme of growth as we go deeper. So to help us explore this topic and to unearth the subject of role models and the role that men in particular can play and need to play in making more positive change within the workplace, I've found a really and truly exceptional guest to talk to today. So Joel Hines, massive welcome to the show. Really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, great. And Joel, we caught up recently for coffee and a toasty nearby in Dalesford, which is outside of Melbourne. But yeah, what a pleasure that was. You're a facilitator, you're an educator, author, but you've done a few things along the way. You worked in IT, you've been a principal at a school, you were director of education training at the Rites of Passage Institute, and head of academy at the Man Cave Global, which is Australia's leading preventative mental health charity for teenage boys and their communities. And you've done a lot of amazing things. You've also done the legendary Chaos Pilot training, which we might talk about as well. If you haven't heard of that, you should check it out. But I think we're really well placed today to have this discussion about the role of men and the behaviours that we both kind of model, or everyone models. These behaviours, I think, for men, it feels like with anybody, behaviours form from an early age, and then you take them into the workplace in some way. And obviously, we think about these things maybe less frequently, but we can have a huge influence personally, really, and we have a huge capability and opportunity, really, to facilitate change within the workplaces that we spend a lot of time in. So I want to start with, that's the workplace and the workforce and everything else. Before that happens, if we rewind to where things start to form in terms of behaviors and attitudes and values, I want to start with adolescents and particularly boys, the boys that you worked with. And I'd love to just hear about some of the situations that you've been privy to, and maybe just describe some of the work that you've done, if we could start with that.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing that comes to mind is like my own teenage experience, right? Like, so as a teenager myself, that was a lived experience for me. And I'm not sure what kind of teenager you were, but for me, I was very much like the chameleon type that would sort of change my kind of perspective potentially, depending on what group that I was in, and just really try and morph into the persona that needed to happen in order to kind of connect and be part of that group. And I guess the work that I've done over the last 7 years or so has been largely with teenage boys. And I really see that playing out. Like there's the two things that really sort of stick out to me. One is that there's a fear of judgment, a fear of being judged for either being different or being something else other than what the people in that group might be. And the other one is I guess it kind of is a paradox or sort of joins with that, is that fear of not fitting in or not being part of the group. And so sometimes, like myself, young people will do things or do behaviors that perhaps aren't in line with their core values and their belief systems, but it's because what they see other people doing that they think they need to do those things in order to fit in.
Mm.
And so I guess one of the big things that in the work that I've done with young people has been really trying to see them and help them to kind of see themselves. And identity is what they're looking for. They're trying to, find who they are and who they want to become. And so giving them an opportunity to see different aspects of masculinity, femininity, being a citizen of the world gives them a more rounded view or a more rounded approach in order to really become who it is that they are. And so when I think about like, how does that then translate then into the workplace? Well, young people grow up. Young people have that conditioning from a young age of who are the people that are around them, the role models that they look up to. And let's face it, like if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're even a coach at a footy club, or even if an uncle or something like that, you are a role model because young people are looking and seeing, maybe not like consciously, but they're seeing who you are, how you behave, how you show up. And they will then try to emulate that. They'll try and copy those behaviors. And so the idea of having role models doesn't seem to sort of change for us. Each little step up the little ladder of life that we go on, we've always got people above us that we're kind of seeking to be a bit like or wanting to sort of live into, oh, I love the way they do that, or their strengths or their gifts. And so I think when we think about the workplace and being leaders, certainly from my experience, I've tried to lead with that knowledge of being a role model in mind.
And tell me about that. I mean, your experience, you were talking a bit about your teenage years a little bit and the type of teenager that you were. And maybe since then, you've obviously reflected on how that role modeling, what it meant to you personally. But tell us a bit about your journey through the stages of work and the things that you've done and how that theme almost connects to the things that you've been able to do through work.
Yeah. Well, the first step into the workplace was as an occupational therapist, and I went into mental health. And so I had, interestingly, in the course, the university degree, 4 years of university, and then also into the profession was largely dominated by females. And so it was sort of like a 70-30 split. And so a lot of the role modeling in terms of I guess, the care environment or the helping profession sort of environment, I was getting sort of cues and role modeling from women largely, which was a really interesting experience for me to lean into some of those aspects of my own personality. I fully believe that we each have masculine and feminine within us, and it's about balancing those two things rather than being one or the other. And so, like, the experience of actually having a lot of role models in that sort of setting, in the female sort of persona, was enabled me, I suppose, to live into perhaps sort of more of the feminine side of me. Then when I moved into IT, which was sort of a bit of a jump after a couple of different changes, I was largely on my own. I was working for myself, and I was working for a lot of small businesses. I was almost like the IT department that you call when you're not big enough to have an IT department. And so I was working with a mix of different people, but I was taking a lot of my cues or whatever from information that I was looking up or people that I was studying to get more information. And that was a whole range of different people again. And then when I moved into education and training and also in the schools environment, again, in primary schools, largely female dominated industry. But then when we sort of step outside of that, there's a lot of male leadership in some of those schools as well. And so, again, there was a range of different experiences that I was drawing upon and seeing within my mind's eye. And I really started to reflect, I suppose, what is it that is innately me? What is my authentic leadership? And what I came to realize, I guess, was that I had all the answers for myself. I didn't have to necessarily take all the cues from everyone. Obviously, they were influences and ideas, but ultimately my identity came from me. And so I guess what I do in my work now is really encourage leaders to be more themselves, to share more of themselves and be truly who they are. Because I've experienced it when it's not been that way. I've been in leadership positions where I've taken that kind of stoic masculine role of I need to have all the answers. I need to be in control. I don't show my emotions. I don't necessarily kind of ask for help when I need it. And it's those examples in my experience that, like, I've learned the lesson the hard way is like, it's not good for me and it's not good for my team around me, particularly from a mental health perspective and well-being perspective, but also getting the best results. Right? Like, if we collaborate with everyone in our team and ultimately use the gifts and the strengths that all of the members of the team have, and they contribute to the solution of innovation or product or whatever it might be, then ultimately the product's going to be much better than any idea I could bring to the table on its own. So I guess like through all the experiences I've had, it's really been about coming back to the authentic person that I am and being that as much as I can. So then I can role model that for others, and in leadership positions where I've kind of cognitively had that kind of sense of who I am and been real, other people have shown up in the same way. It's almost like it gives them permission to be themselves as well.
Yeah, okay. So you're almost demonstrating the values and the behaviors that you want to see in other people a little bit
Yeah,
too.
for sure.
Uh, yeah, I mean that's interesting. I think a lot of people have been in a fortunate position like you have to kind of move from managing kids essentially in primary school setting to obviously seeing the other side, which is in the world of work and corporate, which is a different place. But maybe if you can manage kids, you can manage grown-ups. I don't know. Is it the same? Does it start with you, or does it start with the people around you? What do you think?
I think it always starts with yourself. You've got to have the awareness of yourself first before you're able to recognize it necessarily in others. But
Hmm.
I definitely think there are behaviors that I have carried from my childhood and my teenage years into my adult life. And I've definitely seen that play out for others as well. Particularly like if I ask the question, what kind of teenager were you? Quite
Hmm.
often, like you see little nuances of behavior in those people that are still there from those teenage years. We've got to remember when that identity forms, like our brains haven't fully developed, but we're getting all these new signals and information in about who we possibly could be, what the world is asking for us, all those sorts of things. And that identity can hold really strongly at that time. We're really open, I guess, to the different ideas and different influences. And so some of those things can really stick at that point and then stay with us. And I've just turned 50 and it's like I'm still unraveling some of those things from my own experience.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because I guess your capacity for learning and the extent to which you would want to learn from other people in various situations, maybe that appetite kind of goes up and down. Like sometimes you're really hungry for it one day, other times you're not. Like you're more in your own headspace and you're trying to obviously project more. So I think that constant fluctuation, it feels like, from self-awareness to feeling, the outside inputs and the outside influences that you can obviously learn from, it's kind of an interesting dynamic. How much time do you spend around what type of people in the day at work? How is that affecting you? What are you taking from it? Some of these questions sort of, you wouldn't think of it that actively or that consciously through the day. But if you think back, actually, it's a bit like when they talk about the 5 people that you spend the most time with and how they have the most influence over you
Mm.
in who you are today. And is that right? Are you hanging around with people that have got a negative influence? I mean, all of that stuff would be true from the school days, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. So like you're making these choices. How does it make you feel subconsciously or consciously? And you've got to steer yourself through that. I mean, there's no solution for playground politics or even corporate politics. But I think some of the things that you're describing would obviously help navigate that in some way and for people to be a bit more aware. Have there been sort of specific, I guess, ways in which you've helped people understand that and been more confident going into social settings or around self-awareness, but also around the awareness of environment in some way?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a few examples. Like if I bring a teenage example, I remember running a
Mm,
workshop with some teenage boys at a particular time, and we did like a sharing circle on their challenges. What challenges were they facing at that time?
mm,
And what was really interesting is like they all, like, once one person kind of had the courage to kind of share their story, it really opened up the rest of them to do the same. It was
mm,
almost like someone had to kind of pull the plug and make it all happen. But then once it did, like everyone felt that sort of sense of safety to do so themselves. And it was interesting after that sort of part of it, we did a little debrief on what the experience was like for them and what did they sort of take from, what did they enjoy. And there was a few comments of like, oh, I really didn't know that was going on for that person. Now I feel the same way, like, and I don't feel so alone anymore. That was sort of probably a big part of it. That sort of sense of this story that I had in my own mind that was going on and on and on. I was thinking, this is only me that ever experienced this. And
mm.
to hear someone else that I'm going to school with that has that same thing was such a liberating thing for them. The other thing that came out of that debrief, though, was like the learning that happened through that experience. So one boy sort of basically shared that, and he said, "Look, through that experience, I really understand what empathy is now." Like I've been told what it is and I've been told the definition, they've been teaching us about it, but I really felt it today. Like I really felt this sense of empathy and now I know what it means. And so for me, it was almost like just by the conversation that was having and the stories that were shared, they were able to learn something about themselves and each other as well and be able to put like a name to that feeling that they have.
When do you think, in the context of work, maybe now, but when do you think is the right time to have these sorts of conversations? Because it doesn't just kind of pop into the agenda halfway through before the tea break. You've got to actually, you've got to design, and you almost say as a designer, you're a designer as well, facilitator, but you almost got to design the conditions for how that can work and play out in a way that feels right. And
Yeah.
it would be a little bit unexpected and maybe a bit confrontational for some people if they weren't expecting to get into something that deep one day that was happening. So when would be the right point, and how would that be set up in the right way, do you think?
Yeah, I think for me, it was always part of my process, I suppose, to do what the tool that we call a check-in. And checking in can be like if you use the analogy of going on a flight, sometimes you've only got hand luggage and there's only a little bit, you don't need to check anything in. Sometimes you've got two big bags and a big cardboard box and all the rest of it, and there's a lot of stuff there that you got to check in. And so your level of check-in can be different in many ways. But I'm a firm advocate of connection before content. And so that's in a meeting, that's in a presentation, that's in a workshop that I run. How can we break down those barriers and give people that sort of sense of safety and trust to actually share where they're at and what's going on? The two things that I find that work really well for that are story and play. And so, like I said in the example with the teenage boys, someone always has to go first. So if you're the leader or you're the facilitator, perhaps it's up to you to go first, right? And actually just share, look, this is where I'm at right now. I've got some stuff going on at home, or my parents are a little bit unwell at the moment. Like just giving a little bit of yourself. You would be amazed at how much permission, safety, and trust that creates for other people to go, oh, if they've done it, I can do it too. The other one is play, right? So like, how can you have like a bit of fun or a bit of play to break that sort of sense of uncomfortableness? And naming that uncomfortableness, sort of say, hey, look, this might feel a bit weird. This might feel a bit strange, but I want to try something new. Would you be willing to give it a go? And it's always invitational. We have a term that I've used often called challenge by choice. So, challenging or inviting people to do something, but always making sure they've got a choice in order to how much they want to step in. You can bring in both elements at the same time, right? If you were a piece of fruit right now, Chris, what would you feel like? And you might say, oh, well, I feel like a strawberry today because I'm a bit kind of red on the outside. Hey?
I was going to say strawberry, actually. I thought you were
there you go. Yeah. But like it can be a little bit light and fun. And I think with these things, like everything, when it's uncomfortable to begin with, it's like the more practice we get, the better we get at it. And the easier it becomes. It's like going to the gym. If you've ever been to the gym and you haven't been for a while, you kind of wake up a bit sore the next day and maybe the day after. But if you keep going back, like that soreness it's not quite as great every single time. So it's the same with this kind of stuff. When we talk about social emotional things, we've got to start small. We've got to practice often, and we get a familiarity and a fitness to actually sort of speaking about this stuff. So I guess that's how I would bring it in if I was stepping into a new organization and in a leadership position or whatever. It wouldn't be the first thing I do, but like the first thing I would do is just like try and extract a little bit of stories and by sharing my own. This is where I've come from. This is what I'm about. This is what I do on weekends. Like just those little benign things sometimes that we think, oh, no one would be interested in that. We find connections through the smallest of conversations. There's a couple of icebreakers that I run quite often in workshops where it's just a 1-minute conversation about a particular topic. And people, like I ask the question, hands up if you learned something new about someone, and all the hands go up after 1 minute of conversation. Just a story in 1 minute can open the doorway, the pathway to connection like you wouldn't think is possible. But it really is incredible what it can do.
And I mean, in running that exercise and in different groups, I suppose I'm considering probably more progressive teams, more diverse teams, and then the ones that are probably more traditional, right? Your alpha male kind of guys that probably wouldn't be used to having this conversation. How are you seeing some of those different groups work differently from one another?
I think the practice for me would be the same.
Mm.
The persistence and the consistency is probably the two things. If it doesn't work once, doesn't mean you don't try it again. Like, and it's like sometimes it takes a while for these things to take hold. And if I liken it, if I use the analogy back to teenagers, I remember running this mentoring program that went for 18 weeks, right? And we paired up men from the community of a whole different bunch of ages, like from 19 to 82, I think they were, with a bunch of teenagers that were at risk of sort of disengagement from school and those sorts of things. The first thing we did every week was a check-in. It was like, how's your week been? How are you going at the moment? It took 12 weeks for this one particular boy to actually say, oh yeah, good, thanks. Like to actually just name how he was feeling in 2 or 3 words. So like just the persistence of having that there as an opportunity, again, it's invitational. It's like, here's something for you. If you want to take it, grab it. But if not, that's okay too. And without judgment, I think that's a big part of it is like, sometimes we can feel forced into things or expected to do things. If this kind of process is done with intention, but also with that choice element in it and the agency piece, it can be even more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, the difference, I suppose, between a school educational environment or just a social one and the workplace is that obviously at the workplace you're getting paid, right? So
Yeah.
people are expecting you to show up and actually contribute. And we talked about this in a previous episode with Berlin. You may have heard that. Basically, everyone's expected to have a voice. So you're feeling that, and it's almost like the pressure is on. Some people are more comfortable with that than others. Other people would rather just observe. They can be judged for that. I feel like there's a lot of judgment in that sense that creeps in because you're either judged on not taking part in one way because it's learned behavior to assume that the people in the loudest in the room, the highest paid and the biggest opinions and all the stuff that goes with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, we accept that's part of business and maybe that needs to change. Do you have a point of view around that?
Yeah, I think like that point that you're sort of saying, like if there's people that are resistant to be a part of it, to me that says they're not feeling safe. Like they're not feeling safe in that environment to share a piece of themselves, or even just sort of to be honest, we're back to that belonging piece of wanting to fit in, right? So I don't want to say anything to get me this way or that way. So I just won't say anything at all. So if that's the case, it's a nice cue, right? Like it's a cue to sort of say, right, what am I doing in this situation? How am I showing up? Whether you're the leader or whether you're just a co-worker, like what can I do that's actually going to make any difference to someone else? So safety and trust take time, and we've got to, like I said before, like do this regularly, more often, in order to open the doorway. But also, like, there's an opportunity that some people don't like to talk in public. Like, they don't feel comfortable doing that. And that's maybe from conditioning from their childhood, or maybe that's they've had a bad experience, or maybe they're just shy and they don't want to. And I think removing that judgment piece is a really big one. And as I said, like teenagers have that fear of judgment. We as adults have that there's that fear of being judged all the time. Sometimes we won't put stuff out on our social media and things because we fear that people might sort of tear it apart, or we fear having an opinion on something because someone will sort of say, oh, that's not right, and like being judged for it. The more that I guess we share our own experience openly and authentically and be true to that, like I think that's a good thing. The other thing is like if someone doesn't want to share, that's a clarity of boundary for them too. Like they're being clear on their boundary that they don't want that. And I think when we feel like our boundaries are being crossed, we sort of push back even further. And so the wall can kind of go up a lot sort of stronger. So again, it's a clear sign that people aren't feeling that sort of safety. It's like they're feeling like their boundary is being encroached upon. The caveat to all that, I guess, is to say that this concept of emotional professionalism too. So like if we're in those environments, telling all our deepest, darkest secrets and exposing ourselves very vulnerably may not be the best option. And that's not what I'm sort of necessarily saying. I think there's a difference between authenticity and vulnerability. Vulnerability sort of says that like we're going to mention something that's really deep and scary potentially for us and puts us out there. But being authentic is just like, actually, no, I don't agree with that. Or actually, this is what I think. And this is my experience. Speaking from that I language, that's being authentic. It doesn't necessarily have to be vulnerable. The two can go hand in hand, but it's not like a match made in heaven that has to happen that way.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. I think that I think tuning in, like you almost got to fine tune your radar to be able to see the difference there, because I don't think it would be that obvious. If somebody was talking to me and you about something and are they being authentic or vulnerable, I think that would be quite blurry for some people.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of examples of like recent conversations that I've had, but yeah, would you know the difference? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good thing to think about because like
Mm,
it definitely is a distinction for me because like when we're breaking down some of the masculine stereotypes, there's this idea that men need to open up more and be more vulnerable.
mm,
And I think like there is in part some truth to that, but what we're really saying is if they can authentically express their emotions, then that is what we're actually after. It's not that they have to cry, which is the antithesis of what the man box says is that boys don't cry, right? So like if we can break that down, what we're really just wanting is like what's actually really going on?
mm.
How do you really feel about this? And it doesn't necessarily mean for me that you have to break down in tears and sort of be a complete mess. But if you are, I will fully receive you no matter what.
So do you think we're kind of pointing the finger at the wrong thing there, in that we're looking to men to be more emotionally available and more transparent, authentic, vulnerable, as you were saying, but actually what's behind that is something deeper. So it's almost like, why are we saying that? If it's anyone that's observing men in action, why are we trying to get them to do that, and what's behind it? And actually it's surfacing a lot more that would become useful, and it would obviously level out the playing field, probably in terms of a work environment and a team culture, in a way that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. So that's what's kind of springing to mind. But yeah, in terms of like the world of work and I guess the role that men are playing and the way in which they're role modeling for a number of people out there, is there anything else that we haven't talked about you think that also needs to change?
Well, I think it's still on the same theme, but that idea of role modeling and that authenticity is such a big piece, and I think what that enables, I guess, in my experience, has been that collaboration and that building of safety and trust. They're the two things that I've sort of noticed, and I would sort of probably argue or put myself out there and say most leaders want the best out of their team and whatever it is that the team is working on, whether it's their product or whether it's their service, whatever it might be. And in my experience, when I have like listened first and spoken last, I've enabled my team to sort of collaborative approach a problem or an innovation with so much more broad scope that we can't help but not have an improved outcome than what we would have come if it was just one person's solid idea. The ability for us to bring an idea to the table and then build upon it from others. Our role as a leader quite often is to make a decision, okay, this is the pathway that we should take. And it's only by having that safety and trust that we're able to actually promote an environment where people feel safe to do that. If we go back to that point around keeping our emotions in, it's also keeping our opinions in. Like when we talk about the levels of psychological safety in an environment or in a team, it's often if I feel safe to offer my opinion, even if it goes against the grain, then like that's where you're going to get those sparks of like juice that are really going to create that sense of innovation in a product, because it's like, oh, we haven't looked at it like that before. Sometimes we can have blinkers on and be in tunnel vision. I've certainly done that as a leader. I've gone, right, this is all there is to think about, and this is the way that we're going to do it. And when someone's kind of felt safe enough to offer an alternative view, it has just changed the perspective to that point of, oh, now we're opening up and we're going divergent and we've got all these options to us. It's not just one solution. It could be many things. And I think that's the greatest capacity that humans have, is to collaborate together and use each other's unique gifts together, ultimately, to bring that together to the best possible scenario.
I think that sort of timing of when to do that exactly as you described it is quite hard still. It feels like even within organizations that we work with, that time to diverge, time to converge on what you're doing, is it time to basically pause and reflect, take a step back, think about other more lateral points of view or inputs that we can take? I think for innovation and obviously in product design and other areas that that we work in. It's really important to do that, and it's almost engineered into the process. But for a lot of other people that aren't trained in this area, it can be hard to do that. It's almost like if we take a school analogy, say you're a teacher and it's approaching the end of the class, you've got a minute to go, and you're still trying to finish the point around the thing that you're teaching about, and you're on the board trying to demonstrate something, and somebody asks a question. It's a question that might lead to another 5 minutes of conversation to basically explain, but a lot of people don't want to hang around for another 5 minutes in the maths class.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you know when to sort of stop? And I think in the spirit of collaboration, you want everybody's points of view to be heard. There's a lot of decisioning in that kind of mix that basically says, I'm going to listen to that person's point of view. I'm going to take it into the thinking, and it's becoming part of the rocket ship that we're building. If we're building that, and then another person's point of view or opinion or input, if it's in at the wrong time, just won't get taken in at all. So, like, there's quite a lot of responsibility there for steering it and for being agreeable, open to other people's points of view, knowing what to bring in, what not to bring in, and yeah, I mean, how should people manage all of that? Is it a conscious thing, or it just feels quite instinctive? But what do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of levels in that, and I think if I take a sort of moment just to step back, I think the one thing that kind of stands out for me is we live in a world right now that is so complex, and navigating that complexity alongside the rapidness of how we live and operate, plus the rapidness of change, we have to be agile. We have to be able to move. And what that often translates to is us just being super busy. How are you going, Chris? Oh, yeah, I'm super busy at the moment. Like, I've got a lot on. And when we're in that mind, we're back in that tunnel vision. We're in that sort of mode of not being able to kind of see the bigger picture. And so I think, like, this great phrase that I often use is slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And like, if we just take the time to slow down a little bit, we can zoom out and get a wider perspective. Multiple perspectives are always great. They always provide us with either affirmation that, yep, we're on the right track, or highlight the things that perhaps we're not doing so well, or the things that we can improve on. And I think we have to find those conscious moments to actually breathe out and actually sit back and reflect on things. A lot of the coaching clients that I've sort of been speaking to lately, it's been a constant thing, is like, I've got so much on my plate. And I keep saying to them, you need to block out CEO time. You need to block out in your diary like a couple of hours where you don't sit at the computer. Perhaps you go for a walk. Perhaps you go somewhere else. That change of perspective opens you up to so many different and broad ideas. I don't know if you've had this experience, but when I've gone on holiday, like went over to Bali once, and suddenly, like, I'm in this new environment. I'm like, oh, all these creative ideas started flooding in. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And then, like, the energy of it was just incredible, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing can happen to us and is accessible to us all the time. Nature is all around us. Just going for a walk with the dog in the park can be what we need to circuit break all the busyness and give us that time to open up our perspective. You alluded to the fact that I've done a bit of work in the rites of passage space, and there are three distinct sort of phases to a rite of passage. So a rite of passage is a transformative experience. So we go into a rite of passage as one thing and we come out another thing. And we can never go back to that thing because we've had this transformation thing that happens. The first step in any rite of passage is separation from the normal. So if you want to create transformation, you want something different, you've got to change up the environment, the place, the conversation. That's why I always say, like, for team building stuff or innovative stuff, offsites are great because it actually breeds an environment where you're not distracted by the busyness and the day-to-day. You've still got that tether, right? If you can get away without technology, preferably, it's incredible what can happen. The openings that can happen, both from a team and a culture point of view, but also from a innovation and development perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool. I love the rites of passage framework that you referenced there. And it kind of answers one of the points or one of the questions that I was going to ask, which is when you encounter people that say they're too busy or have a frustration with the process, I think a lot of that, from what you're saying, depends on in that moment, their connection to something else that might be a distraction or it might be top of mind. But busyness or computers and mobiles and everything else, social media, like all of that gets in the way of that. So I think it's like it's setting up the conditions, obviously, but when I'll ask the question anyway. Like when you get into a situation where you can notice that either somebody is visibly uncomfortable or feels frustrated because they're busy and they'd rather be doing something else, or they don't see the point. These are very real situations, and like you can choose to ignore it if you're a facilitator or if you're presenting or you're managing a discussion in a boardroom somewhere. But like, what would be your advice in that space around managing people that have they're quite clearly disgruntled in some way?
Yeah, yeah. This might sound a bit left field, but I think you'll get the illustration of the point. Being a father of young people as well.
Yeah, I think I mean, based on what you're saying, I think there's probably, and we're talking about male behavior in this episode a little bit. I feel like there's a lot of masking that goes on from men and how they present in the workplace. Obviously, if I'm with you or if I'm with people that I know present a certain way, then you might end up behaving a bit like that. There's almost a bit of a pack mentality, and you'll have seen this through your work with teenage boys and probably in other situations as well. But I'm just trying to figure out from that, how do you go with the flow basically, or do you try and steer it to something else? I think is probably the basic question there, because fitting in is important and making sure that you feel like you're on the same page. But if you're a woman coming into that situation, it would be really hard if that was an established kind of mode of behavior and you weren't feeling comfortable and you were having to suggest a circuit breaker when it wasn't necessarily the right. Didn't it feel like it feels like it would jar quite clearly with the group that was there, because you feel like you're in the minority. And so I'm wondering from that point of view, and in your experience, whether that still works and how you navigate different kind of group scenarios.
It took me back to when my son was a toddler, right? And I was given this piece of parenting advice that you have like 7 seconds to break the cycle, like when they're in that kind of toddler tantrum kind of state. And like you need some sort of circuit breaker, right? And so with my son, he was really into the octonauts when he was young.
Yeah.
And we'd throw in this question when he was right in the thick of it, and we'd say, how many tools has Tweak got in his tool belt? And suddenly he'd like stop and think and go, and suddenly he was broken out of whatever it was that he was in that endless loop with, right? So the parallel or the kind of analogy is thus, like, so if you see someone that's in that state, how can you circuit break with something just out of left field and suggest something that maybe is like just ludicrous to actually break that cycle? And it might be as simple as like, okay, what I want you to do is stop what you're doing. I need you to take a half-hour break, and this is what I want you to do with it. I want you to go down to the local park. I want you to take your shoes off and walk on the grass. Promise me you're going to do that. Great. See you in half an hour. And sometimes it's just like those like off-the-cuff kind of creative ideas that break the circuit of where they're at, that can give you the space or the separation to actually see the wood through the trees and actually then make a clear pathway through. Because as humans, as adults or children, we can't process things cognitively if we're in a heightened emotional state, right? If we're not regulated emotionally, like the message doesn't get through. It physically doesn't get through. There's this little thing called the amygdala, which is like a door that closes and stops the messages getting up into our cognitive brain, up here in the cerebrum. If we're in that heightened emotional state, it's like that fight, flight, freeze thing that it's either open or it's closed. And so if we're in that sort of state, like there's nothing's going to get in, nothing's going to work. So we need to break that circuit. And the best way to do that is with something kind of just like a little bit out of left field. I guess the thing to say there, Chris, it would be nothing changes unless something changes. And so like if we keep, like what's the definition? I think it's like if we keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result, that's the definition of insanity or something like that.
Yeah.
Like it's that, like if you've tried other things and they haven't worked, my invitation is like try something different. And it may not always work. But you're right. It might be too jarring. It might be too left of field. But I guess the thing is, if we keep doing the same things over and over again, then the same things are going to be the result. And if we're wanting sort of change, if we're wanting to build that sort of culture of innovation, trust, growth that you've been talking about for this month, we have to be able to adapt and change to our environments. And like I said before, we're navigating such complexity and rapidly changing environments these days that we have to try different things and we have to stay on top of these things and keep zooming out and zooming in. That macro and micro are so important for us to stay relevant and also stay up to date. And the more time that we can spend, like I sort of said, like slowing down will actually help us speed up, in my experience.
No, that's really good. That's really good. I wanted to follow on from that in terms of asking, in terms of criticism, how do we respond to that? Because I think there are a lot of men, blokes, that, or anyone really, but I feel like men take criticism really badly, and they're quite, it's unexpected sometimes, and there's a lot of heated situations that feel like they're created because there's an unexpected exchange. There's a strong view, and it's quite direct, or it wasn't characteristic of that person's personality because they've caught them at a bad time in one of those fight flight type moments. But how do you deal with criticism, and how should one kind of think about that differently, do you think?
Well, I think that it comes back to probably sort of the start of our conversation. That self-awareness piece is like, if you're feeling criticized or you're feeling sort of activated by something that someone else has said, the first step is really to think about, why is this happening? Why am I feeling this? Where is this coming from? What in me is being challenged right now? Our natural inclination is to go other. It's them. It's all their fault. That kind of thing. It's like our natural response. If we can again slow down, take a breath, and actually go, right, what is that's behind me? Why is this impacting me? Then we've got actually a place to look at it. Because to be honest, like, we can't control how anyone else, what they say, what they do. We can control what we can, how we show up, how we respond. And sometimes it's about just taking that sort of breath and thinking about self first before responding or taking that extra step of retaliating or whatever it might be. And when in thinking about that, like, having a bit of personal work has been such a great thing for me. Like, I have learned so much about myself by actually actively spending time on developing myself and exploring some of the things that sort of trigger me in different ways, or some of the feelings that I have and why they're there. And I'd encourage anyone to do that, male or female, or anyone else that in between. So, yeah, I think it comes back to understanding ourselves and what it is, because it's actually us that is being impacted by that comment or that criticism. It's also us that can control what we do with it.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I think we feel the responsibility, we feel the weight sometimes that we're carrying in those situations, and it can force a certain unnatural response. And you can obviously, you can make a fool of yourself. It happens. You can laugh that off, or you can take it really personally. I love what you were saying just there around the self-development, and I wondered if you could maybe just expand on that point. You've worked with obviously adolescents and into adulthood on yourself, and I'm wondering when and how people should be taking more responsibility for themselves, or placing more focus on their own self-awareness and their own learning and development from the point of view that you were describing. So is there anything in the way of a set of steps, or like an entry point, or anything like that, some of the practical things that you think have been really helpful in your journey?
Yeah, look, I think there's many tools and courses and all those things out there. I think my recommendation to people would be, like, if you've never done anything before, like, just put into a search engine self-development or personal development or something and see what comes up. And it's about being a little bit, I guess, exploratory, being curious, but also like listening to that intuition as well and going, like, does that feel right or does that feel right? Like, because there are so many different options, right? You can go down breath work, you can go down yoga, you can go down mindfulness meditation, all those sorts of things. You can go down different faiths, Buddhism or Hinduism or all those sorts of stuff. But at the end of the day, I don't think there's any one recipe for success. It has to mean something to you. And so personal development is personal, right? So we've got to bring it back to what's actually resonating for me. When I was in my 20s, like, a lot of what the Dalai Lama had to say made sense to me. And so I followed a bit of a path of Buddhism exploration for a while there. And I got a lot from that. And that's then sparked inquiry into other things. So I think being just open to the possibility and seeing what comes up is a start. Maybe a safe way is also like to get a therapist, get a counselor or something like that, and actually just explore. Like, I've been having some feelings lately, and this is what it is. I'm just curious to understand more about what I think and how I feel. In my experience, when you start to think about it and it's all going in around in your own mind, it's time to actually start sharing it with someone else. So whether that's like a trusted friend, someone who's paved the pathway before, a mentor, a therapist, someone else, because when you speak it out, my experience has been that I've actually understood more about what I think by talking it out loud rather than just be on loop around in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great stuff in there. I think if you flip that also from what you're describing, there are different opportunities that will present themselves to you. But if we're thinking about it from the point of view of, say, me or anyone else managing you or working with you within the organizational area in your team or whatever, you want to know where people are at from that point of view too. If you had 10 people in your team, in experience design, we talk about meeting people where they're at. It's almost like you've got to take your thing to them and make the connection, make the join there, so that you're situating whatever it is you've come up with in their world, right?
Yeah.
So similarly, like like I was saying, if you had a team of 10, you'd want to know where they're at in their own journey of life in one way or another, and getting to know them in the ways that you were describing earlier in the episode would really help both understand you and your place in relation to that team, but also their position and what they wanted to achieve from the situation. I think if you understand people's higher motives basically and deeper needs and deeper values, then you can often make that situation within work resonate. And you can also it affords you a bit of flexibility. So if you're in a really gritty kind of chat, which happens a lot, and you think the world's going to end today, you can actually use some of that knowledge to link out to a bigger conversation or to take a side step and just say, actually, let's just forget that for half an hour and we'll go and do something else. But yeah, I mean, is there anything else that you'd want to build on that from that point of view or suggest within the kind of team context?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like one simple step that you can take is just like understanding everyone's values and where they intersect, right? Like doing a values exercise is like I've done it a few times over my career and life to kind of just like check in with what's really important to me right now. That's the language that I often use with teenagers, right? Like rather than what are your values, it's like what's important to you. And oftentimes you can get a list of like different things. And what I often do is like a list of 50 or something and say, circle the top 10, right? Let's narrow down that top 10 to your top 5 or your top 3 and kind of just like zero in on those top 3 and go, why is that important to me? And then like you get an answer to that question and then ask, well, why is that important to me? And like ask a few whys. I think they talk about the 5 whys as being sort of a good kind of exercise to try.
Yeah.
Is like why? You get to the core of it and you understand it. If everyone in your team does that sort of process and you find that there's real resonance and linkage and intersection between everyone's values on a particular couple of things, well, then you've got something to leverage as a team. Say courage, creativity, and I don't know, generosity or something where your top 3 that everyone kind of intersected on or most people intersected on. Imagine if you started meetings with that sense of creativity, had some curious questions to sort of prompt people to think about things, and were generous with compliments or acknowledgements of people's sort of gifts and strengths that they've brought to the team in the last week. You're actually like doubling down on those things that you already know are a connection point between the members of your team.
And these are really important building blocks, I think, for inclusivity. We talked a bit about this at the beginning of the chat, but segregation or thinking about inclusivity really, and putting some of these steps in place so that the feeling and the spirit of inclusivity is there. Obviously, at the start of the chat, we were talking about segregation, and I think as soon as you've got differences of opinion, there are ways to handle that, which would make it okay and make it safe for those opinions or feelings to be exchanged. But it feels like the ways in which you're suggesting getting to know people at a deeper level would actually help with that navigation. It's quite a tricky situation. But also you have to put in the work. Like it feels like you can't just turn up as a leader or as a manager of a team or as anyone within a team and not be aware of this. Because if you're just bringing yourself and shutting out everybody else in a sense, then you're not part of the team, right? You're just doing what you want to do.
Yeah.
And you're trying to serve your own needs. But it feels like there's work that needs to be done to get to that higher plane. And if you don't do that, then you'll only be one type of worker. It's kind of the key outtake from me from this conversation. But yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, definitely. I think if we don't sort of share our stories and understand each other, then
Mm,
we can't. We're going in with assumptions, right?
mm,
So a simple thing. So like often when I do workshops, I'll do what I call a group agreement, where I ask people like, what do we need from each other in order to have the best possible workshop here today? And people will offer up their suggestions, and it might be like listening or not laughing at each other or respect, whatever. But until I ask the question, what does respect mean to you? Like that's where we get the real the gist of it. It's because respect could mean something completely different to you than it does to me.
mm,
And so we need to hear each other out in terms of what those things mean, so then we can get on the same page. Because how can we have sort of an agreement of how we show up with each other if our levels of those things are different and our measures of whether we're in or we're out of alignment with that? And so I think having these conversations more and more and being open, I suppose, to differencing of opinions and
mm.
respecting of differencing of opinions, just the knowledge of having that there immediately makes us sort of like think about, well, how am I actually phrasing this? How am I engaging with this person, with this group? Because I now know that knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you don't. It doesn't have to be just the reserved for, I guess, getting to know the team and understanding the people. You could apply that same technique to trying to agree on some part of the strategy, or it's visioning, or if it's a set of principles that you're using
Yeah,
for your design process or anything like that. I mean, inviting conversation around what that particular thing means to people, I think, is a really it's a powerful tool there. You've got that in
yeah,
your toolkit because you can then unpack the difference of opinion and then use that to bring back together the shared understanding. And if you can facilitate that, then obviously you you feel empowered, but obviously everyone else respects you for that too, in one way or
definitely.
another.
Yeah, and they feel heard. I think that's a big thing. Like for all of us, we want to be heard and seen for who we are, and
Mm,
for us to feel like we belong, which I define differently to fitting in. Right. So fitting in is like you're part of the group. You're there, but sometimes you'll adapt your behaviors, like we talked about before, in order to be there.
mm,
True belonging is being accepted for who you are, whether you've got the same opinion or differencing of opinion. You're accepted because you bring a certain lens to the table that contributes to the greater good of whatever our team is on about. And so, like, if we feel that sense of belonging, we really are able to move forward and understand each other a lot more.
mm. I think there's a lot obviously in the chat today that I've really enjoyed the conversation around almost putting. We did obviously bring up the subject of inclusivity and male modeling within the workplace and looking deeper than that, but also bringing together some of the core values and principles that we can take into the world of work. In knowing ourselves every day, but also in representing ourselves, but also representing and hearing the needs of other people and bringing that shared understanding together. It feels like it's an incredible opportunity for a lot of people out there, irrespective of gender or race or anything else. I think there's just a lot there that I feel a lot of people from listening to this conversation will really benefit from. So really appreciate you coming onto the show, Joel. And I wanted to end with a quote, which I saw on your website actually, and I wanted to just share it with the listeners as well. But the quote was just amazing. I've never seen a testimonial so strongly but passionately worded, and I just wanted to share it with the group. So it says, "I trust Joel Hines my life. That's not a sentence I say very often or very willingly, but it seems fitting. I begin with this truth. It just so happens I also had the pleasure of working alongside Hines at an organisation, the Man Cave, for a few years, and I picked up a few insights that might entice you to invest your time with this man. Hines is a storyteller who has the rare ability to open hearts and capture imaginations. He has the depth and range to weave folklore with philosophy, psychology with poetry, and quick-witted humour and with unshakable truth." So I just thought I'd finish with that. I mean, Joel, I feel extremely privileged to have had you on the show as a guest. And yeah, thank you so much for pouring your wisdom and points of view and expertise into the Company Road podcast and for the listeners out there. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Chris, and yeah, I really appreciate the really deep questions that you ask. Really, it got me stimulated and thinking. Like I really appreciate the time you've obviously taken to sort of think about things, but how you sort of process and then come back with a really interesting question and curious question. I love that curiosity. So yeah, I really just want to just say I really acknowledge and appreciate that. Thank you.
And for people that want to get in touch and maybe tell us about your book as well a little bit, which I think is just launching. So how would people find out about you, see more, or ask a question?
Yeah, like the main site, my website, beinghuman.net.au, is probably the
Hmm.
easiest place for people to find everything from the book to getting in contact. But I'm on LinkedIn as well, and Instagram and Facebook and all those things as well. So yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy just to have conversations with people and just chat about various things. I think, like you're right, we've covered a lot in this conversation. And so there's many things to potentially unpack with people. If they wanted to reach out, more than happy to have a conversation and chat further about anything we've talked about. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Joel. Appreciate your time. And we'll stop there. Thank you.